August 26, 1071, the Anatolian highlands near the fortress of Manzikert. Emperor Romanos IV. Diogenes of the Byzantine Empire stood at the centre of his battle formation, watching as dust clouds rose on the horizon. The man who wore the purple, who commanded what was supposed to be the mightiest army in Christendom, was about to face a reality that would shatter not just his reign, but the very foundation of Byzantine power for centuries to come. Across that dusty plain, Sultan Alp Arslan, the heroic lion of the Seljuk Turks, prepared his forces with a confidence born from years of conquest. By nightfall, one emperor would be a prisoner, an empire would begin its long collapse, and the doors of Anatolia would swing open to a Turkish migration that would reshape the map of the medieval world forever. This is the story of how a single day's battle became the beginning of the end for one of history's greatest empires. To understand the catastrophe at Manzikert, we must first understand the Byzantine Empire in 1071. This was not the declining, decrepit state that many imagine. Just decades earlier, under the military genius of Basil Lane, called the Bulgar Slayer, the empire had reached heights not seen since the days of Justinian. Basil I, who ruled from 976 to 1025, had crushed the Bulgarian Empire after decades of brutal warfare, culminating in the Battle of Clyden in 1014, where, according to legend, though historians debate its veracity, he blinded thousands of Bulgarian prisoners. Bulgaria became a Byzantine theme, an administrative province, but Basil ruled it with surprising leniency, allowing the Bulgarian church to continue, permitting local elites to govern and respecting their barter economy. These were calculated moves that brought stability to newly conquered territories. The empire Basil left behind stretched from Dalmatia in the west through the entire Balkans, south to Antioch in Syria, and east through all of Anatolia to the Armenian highlands. Constantinople, the Queen of Cities, housed approximately 350,000 souls in 1050, making it one of the largest cities on earth. To put this in perspective, medieval England's entire population was around 1 million. Constantinople alone held a third of that number within its mighty walls. The Byzantine economy was the most sophisticated in Europe, fully monetized when Western Europe still relied largely on barter. The empire's population stood at approximately 12 million, and tax revenues flowed so abundantly into Basil's treasury that he needed to build new vaults to house the gold. But Basil made one critical error. He never married, never produced an heir, and made no adequate plans for succession. When he died in 1025, the throne passed to his brother Constantine VIII, an aging man with no military or administrative talent. Constantine ruled for 3 years before dying in 1028, leaving the succession to his daughters, Zoe and Theodora. What followed was a parade of emperors chosen not for military competence, but for their connection to the Macedonian dynasty through marriage to Zoe. She married 3 times. Her husbands, Romanos III Argyrus, Michael IV, and Constantine Numismonomachus, ruled in succession, but none possessed the martial skill that had built the empire. The problem ran deeper than incompetent emperors. A fundamental divide had opened in Byzantine society between 2 factions, the military aristocracy of the provinces and the civilian aristocracy of Constantinople. The provincial military families had built their wealth and power on land grants in the themes, the military districts that formed the backbone of Byzantine defence. These men believed in strong armies, aggressive campaigns, and emperors who understood warfare. The civilian bureaucracy of Constantinople, sophisticated, educated, and wealthy from trade and administration, favoured emperors who would expand the civil service, distribute lucrative offices, and reverse what they saw as the militaristic excesses of the warrior emperors. Constantine and Monomachus, who ruled from 1042 to 1055, embodied the civilian faction's triumph. A patron of arts and learning, he revived the law school under the jurist John Xiphilinus and appointed Michael Psellus, one of the era's greatest intellects, to chair the School of Philosophy. Psellus would become courtier, statesman, philosopher, and historian, a walking advertisement for the vibrancy of Byzantine intellectual life. But Constantine IX made decisions that would prove catastrophic. Around 1053 he disbanded what the historian John Skylitzes called the Iberian army, a force of 50,000 men. The emperor and his civilian advisers saw the army as an unnecessary expense in an era when threats seemed distant, and as a political danger, since military commanders could and did become rival claimants to the throne. Native troops were cashiered and replaced by foreign mercenaries on specific contracts. The theme system, which had for centuries provided locally raised troops at minimal cost, was allowed to decay. This decision came at precisely the wrong moment. New enemies were emerging on multiple fronts, enemies unlike any Byzantium had faced before. In the west, the Normans, descendants of Viking raiders who had settled in northern France, began their conquest of Byzantine southern Italy in the early 11th century. Under the brilliant and ruthless Robert Guiscard, they swept through Byzantine possessions. The great general George Maniaces had nearly reconquered Sicily from the Arabs in 1042, only to be recalled by Constantine Numd and killed as a pretender. After that, nothing stopped the Norman advance. In April 1071, after a 3-year siege, Bari fell, the last Byzantine stronghold in Italy. 7.5 centuries of Roman and Byzantine rule in Italy ended. The loss seemed to underscore the permanent division between the Greek East and Latin West, a division made official by the Great Schism of 1054, when papal legates placed a bull of excommunication on the altar of Hagia Sophia during Saturday liturgy. In the north, Pecheneg nomads raided Byzantine territories in the Balkans, but the most dangerous threat came from the east, from a people Byzantine chroniclers were only beginning to understand, the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuks were not Arabs, not Persians, but Turkic nomads from the Central Asian steppes, who had converted to Sunni Islam and swept into the Islamic heartlands with devastating effect. Their origins traced back to Seljuk himself, a clan leader among the Oghuz Turkish tribes who had occupied the steppes between the Aral Sea and the Volga River. His descendants, possessed of both nomadic military prowess and Islamic religious fervour, had transformed themselves from steppe warriors into empire builders. The man who would face Romanos at Manzikert was born Muhammad ibn Daud Chagri Beg, probably on January 20th, 1029, though sources differ on the exact date. History would know him as Alp Arslan, which in Turkish means heroic lion or courageous lion, a name he earned through his military exploits. He was the son of Chagri Beg and nephew of Tugril Beg, the founding sultans of the Seljuk Empire. From childhood, Alp Arslan was trained in the harsh school of steppe warfare, learning to ride before he could properly walk, to shoot a composite bow from horseback, and to command men through force of personality and proven courage. When his father died around 1060, Alp Arslan became governor of Khorasan, the vast northeastern province of the Seljuk realm. When his uncle Tugril died in 1063 without heirs, the succession was contested. Tugril had designated Suleiman, an infant, but Alp Arslan would not be denied. He defeated his cousin Kutulmish in the Battle of Damgan in 1063, claiming the sultanate at age 34. His younger brothers and rivals were either eliminated or reduced to vassalage. He had won the throne through force, and he would hold it the same way. But Alp Arslan was more than just a warrior. He understood the limitations of his own administrative skills and had the wisdom to delegate. While still in Khorasan, his father had introduced him to one of history's great statesmen, Nizam al-Mulk, which means Order of the Kingdom. This Persian administrator, aged 42 when he became vizier to Alp Arslan, brought to the Seljuk court a rich Persian administrative tradition, diplomatic finesse, and a commitment to promoting Sunni Islamic education through madrasas. Where Alp Arslan embodied martial prowess, Nizam al-Mulk represented sophisticated statecraft. The partnership between warrior sultan and scholarly vizier would make the Seljuk Empire a dominant force. Contemporary descriptions paint Alp Arslan as an imposing figure, tall and exceptionally strong, his height enhanced by his preference for an unusually high headdress. One charming detail recorded by chroniclers claims that before he drew his composite bow, a servant had to tie back his immense moustache, which would otherwise become entangled in his bowstring. Whether strictly true or not, such stories built the legend of a warrior's warrior, a man whose physical presence matched his reputation. Alp Arslan's strategic vision had 3 components. First, maintain control in Central Asia, where the Karakanids of Transoxiana posed a threat. Second, eliminate the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, which represented heretical Ismaili Shi'ism and challenged the orthodox Sunni Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, whose protector the Seljuks claimed to be. Third, manage the Oghuz Turkic tribes, sometimes called Turkmens, whose military power formed the backbone of Seljuk armies, but whose interests lay primarily in raiding Christian territories and expanding westward. These tribesmen cared little for grand strategy and much for plunder and pasture land. Throughout the 1060s, Turkish raids into Byzantine Armenia and eastern Anatolia intensified. These were not initially organised Seljuk state campaigns, but rather the actions of semi-autonomous Turkmen bands seeking wealth and territory. In 1064 they sacked Ani, the ancient capital of Armenia, a city of churches and monasteries that had been one of the jewels of the medieval world. The Byzantines proved incapable of stopping them. The heavy infantry and cavalry of the Tagmata, the professional regiments that replaced the old theme levies, were designed for set-piece battles against conventional armies. They could not catch the swift Turkish horse archers who would raid, plunder and vanish into the rugged terrain before Byzantine forces could respond. Emperor Constantine X Ducas, who ruled from 1059 to 1067, continued the policies of his predecessor Constantine IX, favouring the civil administration over military expenditure. When he died, his widow Eudokia faced a crisis. The empire needed a soldier emperor, someone who could restore military discipline and drive back the Turkish incursions. The solution was a marriage of political necessity. Eudokia married Romanos Diogenes, a capable general from Cappadocia who had actually been imprisoned for plotting against Constantine VI. On January 1, 1068, Romanos was crowned as Romanos IV Diogenes, becoming emperor through his marriage to the widow of his former enemy. Romanos was approximately 40 years old, a seasoned military commander who understood warfare and recognized the empire's desperate situation. The eastern provinces, the heartland of Byzantine military recruitment and agricultural production, were hemorrhaging away under constant Turkish pressure. Something had to be done, and Romanos believed the solution lay in offensive action. In 1068, he led an expedition against the Turks, but his slow-moving infantry could not catch the mobile Turkish cavalry. He managed to recapture Hierapolis, but this was a minor success in a campaign that revealed how poorly suited Byzantine forces were to fighting this new enemy. In 1070, Romanos led a second expedition toward Manzikert, a fortress in eastern Anatolia near Lake Van that the Seljuks had captured. This time he offered Sultan Alp Arslan a treaty. Romanos would return Hierapolis if Alp Arslan would lift his siege of Edessa. The Sultan, whose primary focus remained on Egypt and the Fatimids, agreed. But this treaty was a deliberate deception on Romanos's part. In early 1071, while Alp Arslan took his armies south to attack Fatimid-controlled Aleppo, Romanos assembled the largest army he could muster and marched east into Armenia, intending to recapture the lost fortresses before the Seljuks could respond. The army Romanos assembled was a reflection of Byzantine strengths and fatal weaknesses. He had approximately 5,000 professional Byzantine troops from the western provinces, and roughly the same number from the eastern provinces. These included the regular units of the Tagmata, the Hetairai, the Skolai, and the Strelati, the elite formations that had served Byzantine emperors for generations. But Romanos needed more men. He hired Frankish and Norman mercenaries, Germans, Pechenegs, even August Turks who were willing to fight against their cousins for Byzantine gold. He brought along Armenian and Georgian auxiliaries from the buffer states. In total, the army may have numbered between 40 and 50,000 men, though exact figures remain disputed and Byzantine sources would later exaggerate the numbers to make the defeat seem more catastrophic. The march across Anatolia in the spring and summer of 1071 was long and difficult. Romanos did not endear himself to his troops by bringing along a luxurious baggage train befitting an emperor, which slowed the march and emphasized the distance between the purple-born ruler and his suffering soldiers. Worse, the Frankish mercenaries began plundering the local Byzantine population, causing Romanos to dismiss them, thereby reducing his force before he even engaged the enemy. The expedition rested at Sebastea on the Halys River, reaching Theodosiopolis in June 1071. At Theodosiopolis, Romanos's generals debated strategy. Some, recognizing that Alp Arslan was engaged in Syria, suggested pushing deeper into Seljuk territory to catch the Sultan before he could organize resistance. Others, including the experienced general Nicephorus Bryennius, counselled caution. They should fortify their position and wait for the enemy to come to them. Romanos chose the aggressive option. He believed, or at least hoped, that Alp Arslan was too far away to respond quickly. The Byzantine army would march to Manzikert, recapture it, and if possible seize the nearby fortress of Kaliat. These fortresses would secure the eastern frontier and allow Romanos to winter in safety before continuing operations the following year. But fate and Byzantine politics would destroy this plan. Accompanying Romanos on the campaign was Andronikos Doukas, son of Caesar John Doukas, the power behind the throne during the reign of Michael VII and a bitter enemy of Romanos. The Doukas family represented the civilian aristocracy of Constantinople, and they had never forgiven Romanos for marrying the Empress Eudokia, thereby bypassing the Doukas' claim to power. Andronikos commanded the rearguard, a position of critical importance. Whether through incompetence, cowardice, or deliberate treachery, his actions would prove decisive. Romanos made a fateful decision as his army approached Manzikert. He split his forces. He ordered General Joseph Tarchoniotes to take perhaps 20,000 men, including Varangian guards, Pechenegs, and Frankish troops, and march north to besiege Kliat while Romanos and the rest of the army would take Manzikert. This division of forces violated a fundamental principle of warfare: never divide your army in the face of the enemy. What exactly happened to Tarchoniotes remains one of history's mysteries. Byzantine sources are strangely silent. Muslim sources describe a Seljuk victory over his force. Perhaps Tarchoniotes was defeated. Perhaps he deserted, either out of loyalty to a rival claimant to the throne or from his own imperial ambitions. Perhaps he simply decided the campaign was doomed and retreated. Whatever the truth, the result was that Romanos was left with roughly half the army he had started with, and he did not know it. Tarchoniotes' force would not participate in the coming battle. They simply vanished, appearing later at Melitene, their absence unexplained. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the south, Sultan Alp Arslan received news that stunned him. The Byzantine emperor, with whom he had recently signed a peace treaty, had led a massive army into Armenian territory and was assaulting Seljuk possessions in the Sultan's rear. Alp Arslan's reaction was swift and decisive. He abandoned his campaign against Aleppo, turned his army around, and force-marched north at a pace that caught the Byzantines completely off guard. The Sultan covered the distance from Aleppo to the Manzikert region in days, a feat of logistical brilliance that demonstrated why he had earned his nickname. Romanos was completely unaware of Tarchoniotes' desertion or Alp Arslan's approach. On August 23, 1071, he easily captured Manzikert, which was lightly defended. The following day, Friday, August 24th, Byzantine foraging parties under Bryennius discovered the Seljuk force and were forced to retreat hastily back to Manzikert. Romanos, confident that this could not possibly be the Sultan's main army, sent out the Armenian general Basilissus with a cavalry force to investigate. The result was catastrophic. Basilissus' cavalry was destroyed, and he was taken prisoner. Now Romanos understood the truth. Alp Arslan was here, with his main army, and the Byzantine force was in mortal danger. The emperor had two options. He could retreat, abandoning Manzikert and falling back to consolidated positions where he could await reinforcements. Or he could fight, using his superior numbers, his professional troops, and his heavy cavalry to smash the Turks in the kind of set-piece battle Byzantine armies had won for centuries. Romanos chose to fight. Perhaps he believed he still had numerical advantage. Perhaps he could not bear the political consequences of retreat. Perhaps he genuinely believed that Byzantine discipline and armour could overcome Turkish mobility and archery. Whatever his reasoning, on Friday, August 25th, he arrayed his entire army for battle. On the Turkish side, Alp Arslan faced his own decision. His force was outnumbered, perhaps significantly so. The Byzantines had heavier armour, better infantry, and a reputation built over centuries, but the Sultan had advantages too. His army consisted almost entirely of horse archers, men who had learned to ride and shoot before they could walk. Warriors for whom warfare on horseback was not a skill, but an identity, and he had supreme confidence in his own tactical abilities and his men's courage. On Friday evening, before the battle, Alp Arslan did something that Muslim chroniclers would remember for centuries. He gathered his commanders and warriors and spoke to them. "I want to attack the enemy at this hour when Muslims are praying for us in mosques across the Islamic world. If we win, the result we desire will be achieved. If we are defeated, we will go to heaven as martyrs. Today, there is neither a sultan giving orders nor a soldier taking orders. I will fight with you as one of you. Those who want to come with me can follow me. Those who do not want to can freely return. According to tradition, he wore a white robe symbolizing his readiness for martyrdom and cut his arrows shorter, signifying that he expected close combat. The psychological impact on his troops was enormous. They would not just be fighting for their sultan, but alongside him, as equals in holy war. Meanwhile, at the Byzantine camp, morale was less certain. The troops knew they had marched deep into enemy territory. They knew Tarchoniates and his 20,000 men were missing. They knew Basileus had been captured, and they knew that the rearguard was commanded by Andronikos Doukas, a man whose loyalty to the emperor was questionable at best. August 26, 1071, dawned over the Anatolian plain, a Friday afternoon when the battle would begin in earnest. Romanos arrayed his army in the traditional Byzantine formation. Infantry formed several rows in the centre, creating a solid block of spears and shields. Heavy cavalry occupied the wings. Romanos himself, contrary to usual practice for an emperor, donned armour and positioned himself at the very centre of the line. The historian Michael Psellus, who knew Romanos and chronicled this period, criticised the emperor for this decision. He argued that Romanos was hacking away at the enemy like a common soldier, without any concern for his person or his responsibility as overall commander. But perhaps Romanos understood that his men needed to see their emperor fighting beside them, that morale required visible leadership. The Byzantine army was formidable. The professional troops of the Tagmata wore scale or lamella armour. They carried the Contarian lance, the Spathion sword, and large shields. The cavalry were some of the finest heavy horsemen in the world, capable of delivering devastating charges. But the Byzantine formation had a critical weakness. It was designed for frontal combat, for crushing an enemy through weight and discipline. It was not designed for an enemy that refused to stand and fight. Alp Arslan had no intention of fighting a conventional battle. His tactics represented centuries of steppe warfare perfected into an art form. He arranged his forces in a crescent formation, the classic nomadic array that allowed for envelopment. His horse archers, armed with powerful composite bows that could penetrate armour at close range, would harass the Byzantine flanks. When the Byzantines advanced to close with them, the Turks would retreat, the feigned retreat that had destroyed countless heavy cavalry forces throughout history. The Byzantines would follow, their lines stretching and breaking cohesion. When the enemy was sufficiently disordered, the Turks would turn and attack from multiple directions. As the afternoon wore on, this pattern repeated endlessly. The Byzantine centre, with Romanos at its heart, advanced steadily. The Turkish forces gave way before them, maintaining just enough distance to avoid decisive contact. Byzantine cavalry on the wings attempted to ride down the Turkish horse archers, but the Turks simply galloped out of reach, then turned and poured arrows into the pursuing Byzantines. The armour that made Byzantine cavalry so powerful also made them slow. The very weight that gave them shock impact in a charge made them vulnerable to a more mobile enemy. For hours the battle continued in this frustrating pattern. The Byzantines moved forward, the Turks melted away, arrows fell like rain on the Byzantine formations, and while many were stopped by armour and shields, some found gaps, hitting men in the face. The legs, the arms, horses went down screaming, men fell and were trampled. The Byzantine right and left wings suffered the worst, where the arrow attacks concentrated. Individual units, frustrated by their inability to close with the enemy, broke formation and charged after the Turks, only to find themselves isolated and surrounded. The Turkish cavalry would pounce on these isolated units, destroying them quickly with concentrated archery and close-range attacks, then disappear before relief could arrive. By late afternoon, Romanos could see that his army was accomplishing nothing. They had advanced across the battlefield and captured the Turkish camp, but this was a hollow victory. The Seljuks had abandoned it deliberately. His men were exhausted, his horses were blown, his formations were stretched and disordered. Casualties were mounting, not from a decisive engagement but from the cumulative effect of hours of constant arrow fire. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, Romanos made the decision to withdraw back to the Byzantine camp outside Manzikert. They would regroup, rest, and resume battle the next day, perhaps with a different tactical approach. Here, disaster struck. The withdrawal of a large medieval army in the face of the enemy was always dangerous. It required discipline, clear orders, and troops who trusted their commanders. The Byzantine army had been fighting for hours. They were exhausted, frustrated, and demoralized. When the order to withdraw was given, it was not executed uniformly. The right wing, misunderstanding the order or panicking, broke formation and began retreating in disorder. Some units thought they had been ordered to return to camp and simply left the field, and then Andronikos Doukas, commanding the reserve and rear guard, committed what Byzantine historians would forever label as the ultimate treachery. Whether he deliberately ignored the emperor's orders or genuinely believed the battle was lost is debated. What is certain is that Andronikos marched his troops directly back to the camp outside Manzikert rather than covering the emperor's withdrawal as his position required. He abandoned the emperor on the battlefield. Alp Arslan, watching from his command position, saw the Byzantine formation disintegrating. This was the moment every steppe commander lived for, when a disciplined enemy broke cohesion and became vulnerable. He ordered the general attack. The Turkish forces, which had been harassing and withdrawing all day, suddenly turned and charged from all directions. The crescent formation closed like a trap. The Byzantine right wing, already in disorder, was routed almost immediately. Men threw down their weapons and ran. The left wing under Nicephorus Bryennius held longer. These were veteran troops who maintained their discipline and fought stubbornly, but they were surrounded and overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Eventually, even Bryennius's wing broke. Some of his men managed to cut their way out and escape. Bryennius himself survived, fighting with great courage, but he could not save the army. At the centre, Romanos IV Diogenes made his stand. The emperor, surrounded by his bodyguard and the most loyal units of the tagmata, fought on, even as the rest of the army disintegrated around him. For a brief moment there was a possibility that the Byzantine centre might hold long enough for darkness to fall, allowing some organised withdrawal. But the Turks had tasted victory and would not be denied. They swarmed around the Byzantine centre, cutting it off completely from any hope of relief. Romanos fought like the soldier he had always been. He wielded his sword with skill, his armour dented and bloodied, his guards dying around him one by one. But he was not a young man anymore, and he was vastly outnumbered. Eventually, exhausted and wounded, Romanos was pulled from his horse. The Byzantine guardsmen around him were slaughtered to the last man. The Emperor of the Romans, successor to Augustus and Constantine, wearer of the purple, was a prisoner. When the Seljuk soldiers realized they had captured the Byzantine emperor, they brought him before Sultan Alp Arslan. What followed became one of the most famous exchanges in medieval history, recorded by both Muslim and Christian chroniclers. The Sultan, tall and imposing in his white robe now stained with dust and blood, looked down at the defeated emperor. Alp Arslan asked Romanos, "What would you do if I was brought before you as a prisoner?" Romanos, bruised and defeated but still defiant, replied, "Perhaps I would kill you, or exhibit you in the streets of Constantinople." The Sultan paused, then delivered his judgment. "My punishment is far heavier. I forgive you and set you free." This moment reveals something profound about both men and about the nature of their conflict. Alp Arslan had won a complete victory. The Byzantine emperor was his prisoner, an unprecedented achievement in Islamic history. No Muslim commander had ever captured a Byzantine emperor before. This was a triumph that would resound across the Islamic world. Yet Alp Arslan chose mercy. He treated Romanos with respect, entertained him at his table for a week, and negotiated a peace treaty. The terms were severe but not crushing. Byzantium would cede certain territories, pay tribute, and provide military assistance if the Sultan required it. In essence, the Byzantine Empire would become a client state of the Seljuks. Then Alp Arslan released Romanos, providing him with gifts and a military escort. The Sultan's mercy was not just magnanimity, it was strategic calculation. Alp Arslan's primary objective remained the Fatimids in Egypt. He had no interest in conquering all of Anatolia or destroying the Byzantine Empire completely. What he wanted was a secure northern frontier and a tributary relationship that would prevent Byzantine interference in his campaigns to the south. A grateful Romanos, restored to his throne, would provide exactly that. What Alp Arslan could not have anticipated was the depth of Byzantine political dysfunction. The battlefield at Manzikert told a story written in bodies and broken equipment. Byzantine casualties were not as catastrophic as later sources would claim. Perhaps 8,000 killed, many more wounded and thousands captured. The Armenian and Oghuz Turkish auxiliaries deserted during or after the battle. Of the perhaps 40,000 men Romanos had led to Manzikert, approximately 30,000 survived. In purely military terms, this was a severe defeat, but not annihilating. The Byzantine Empire, with its resources and manpower, could recover from such losses. The empire's total military strength was perhaps 100,000 men. Manzikert had cost them roughly 20%. Painful, but not fatal. But the political consequences were catastrophic. While Romanos was a prisoner, events in Constantinople moved with terrible speed. The Ducas family, led by Caesar John Ducas, used the Varangian Guard to declare Romanos deposed and Michael VII, son of Constantine X, and Eudokia as sole emperor. The Empress Eudokia was forced to take monastic vows. When Romanos was released and returned to Byzantine territory, he discovered he was no longer emperor. He was a traitor to be hunted down. Romanos gathered loyal troops and marched on Constantinople, but he was defeated by an army under Constantine Ducas. He retreated to Cappadocia, hoping to winter there and rebuild his forces. In the spring of 1072, another Byzantine army, this one commanded by Andronikos Ducas himself, the man who had betrayed him at Manzikert, defeated what remained of Romanos's forces. The former emperor, realizing his position was hopeless, agreed to surrender in return for safe conduct into exile. But Caesar John Ducas had no intention of honouring this agreement. Romanos was captured and savagely blinded, a traditional Byzantine punishment for failed emperors. The blinding was so brutal that Romanos died shortly afterward from his wounds. The civil war that followed Manzikert would last for a decade, during which 8 different revolts took place. The damage to the empire was compounded by a particularly insidious development. The various factions, desperate for military power, began hiring Turkish mercenaries. These Turks, paid by Byzantium to fight other Byzantines, began settling in Anatolia. They sent word to their kinsmen that the land was rich and the defences weak. What had begun as mercenary service became migration and conquest. A Norman mercenary named Roussel de Bailleul exemplified the chaos. Roussel had fought at Manzikert commanding a contingent of 500 Frankish troops. After the battle, seeing Byzantine authority collapse, he rebelled and attempted to carve out his own principality in northeastern Anatolia. 2 Byzantine imperial campaigns to subdue him, in 1073 and 1074, only spread the chaos further. To defeat Roussel, the Byzantine commander Alexios Komnenos allied with Turkish forces under Suleiman ibn Kutalmish, a cousin of Alp Arslan. These same Turks would soon establish their own state in Anatolia, the Sultanate of Rum, meaning Rome, for they saw themselves as the rightful heirs to Roman Anatolia. By 1080, just 9 years after Manzikert, the Seljuk Turks controlled an area of 30,000 square miles in central Anatolia. Not through organised conquest by Alp Arslan's armies, he had been dead since 1072, killed by a prisoner during a campaign in Central Asia, but through migration and settlement by Turkish tribes who saw opportunities in Byzantine weakness. The themes of Anatolia, which had for centuries provided the soldiers and food that made the Byzantine Empire powerful, were gone. The heartland was lost. It would take 3 decades before the Byzantine Empire found a ruler capable of restoring some stability. Alexios Komnenos seized power in 1081 and ruled until 1118. He was a brilliant military commander and a skilled diplomat, and he managed to halt the worst of the collapse. But even he could not undo the damage of the decade after Manzikert. The empire's frontiers would never return to their 1071 positions. The loss of Anatolia meant the loss of military recruiting grounds, agricultural production, and tax revenue that could never be fully replaced. The Battle of Manzikert opened the door to the Turkish settlement of Anatolia, but it also triggered a cascade of consequences across Christendom. When Alexios V appealed to Pope Urban II for military assistance against the Turks, his request would spark the First Crusade in 1095. The Crusaders who marched east came not just to help Byzantium, but to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. Their arrival would create as many problems as it solved for the Byzantines, setting up conflicts between Eastern Orthodox Greeks and Latin Catholics that would eventually lead to the catastrophic Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Christian crusaders sacked Christian Constantinople, an event from which the Byzantine Empire never truly recovered. For the Turks, Manzikert was celebrated as a pivotal moment. Sultan Alp Arslan, though he died just a year after the battle, became a legendary figure in Turkish history. The battle is commemorated every August 26th in modern Turkey, seen as the moment when Anatolia began its transformation from a Greek Christian land to a Turkish Muslim one. The largest mosque in Turkey, the Çamlıca Mosque in Istanbul, has 4 minarets that span exactly 107.1 metres in height, a measurement that refers to the Battle of Manzikert in the year 1071. Byzantine historians, writing in the years and decades after Manzikert, looked back on that day with a mixture of horror and regret. They identified it as the moment when everything went wrong, when the decline of the empire became inevitable. Modern historians are more nuanced. They recognise that Manzikert was not an immediate disaster in purely military terms, but as a psychological blow to Byzantine military prestige, and as a trigger for political chaos, its impact was profound. Historian Thomas Asbridge notes that while historians no longer consider Manzikert to have been an utterly cataclysmic reversal for the Greeks, it still was a stinging setback. John Julius Norwich, in his trilogy on Byzantine history, calls it the empire's death blow, though centuries remained before the remnant fell. The real tragedy of Manzikert lies in what might have been. If Tarchanaiots had not deserted with half the army, if Andronikos Doukas had not betrayed the emperor at the critical moment, if the right wing had not broken in disorder, the battle might have ended differently. Even with these disasters, if the Doukas family had not turned Romanos' defeat into civil war, the empire might have recovered. The military losses at Manzikert were survivable. The political consequences were not. For Anatolia itself, the transformation was gradual but inexorable. Turkish tribes, moving westward from the steppes of Central Asia, found in post-Manzikert Anatolia a land of opportunity. The Byzantine administration had collapsed. The theme armies were disbanded. Local populations, many of whom had been heavily taxed by Constantinople and alienated by religious controversies, sometimes welcomed the Turks as liberators from Byzantine oppression. Over generations, Turkish became the dominant language, Islam became the dominant religion, churches became mosques, Greek towns took on Turkish names. By the time of the Ottoman conquest in the 14th and 15th centuries, much of Anatolia was already thoroughly Turkish in character. The Battle of Manzikert stands as one of history's pivotal moments, not because of the military casualties inflicted or the genius of the tactics employed, though Alp Arslan's strategic mobility and Romanos' flawed decisions both played their part, but because of the door it opened. It was the beginning of a process that would take centuries to complete, the transformation of the ancient heartland of Christianity into the heartland of the Turkish nation. It was the moment when the Byzantine Empire, which had survived barbarian invasions, Arab conquests, and internal convulsions for 7 centuries, began its long descent into irreversible decline. On that hot August day in 1071, as Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes stood surrounded by Turkish warriors, his guards dead at his feet, his army shattered and fleeing across the Anatolian plain, one era ended and another began. The purple he wore, symbol of Roman imperial power stretching back to Augustus, had failed to protect him. The army that had conquered Persia and humbled Attila had been broken by horse archers from the steppes. The empire that called itself eternal had taken a wound from which it would never fully heal. The Seljuk Turks had not just won a battle, they had changed the world. The question that haunted Byzantine writers for generations after Manzikert was simple. How did this happen? How did an empire that had survived for over 700 years since Constantine, that had weathered Persian invasions, Arab sieges and Slavic migrations, suddenly find itself unable to defend its heartland against a nomadic people who had appeared seemingly from nowhere? The answer lies not in a single battle, but in the systemic weaknesses that Manzikert exposed with brutal clarity. The Byzantine military system in 1071 was a shadow of what it had been under the warrior emperors of the 10th century. Basil II, who died in 1025, had commanded armies that were entirely professional, well-equipped, and superbly trained. The tagmata, the elite regiments stationed in Constantinople and the western provinces, were supplemented by the theme armies, provincial forces raised from free peasant soldiers who received land grants in exchange for military service. This system had worked brilliantly for centuries. It provided the empire with a large standing army at minimal cost, and it tied military service to land ownership, creating a class of soldier farmers with a direct stake in defending their territory. but by 1071, this system had been deliberately dismantled. The civilian aristocracy that dominated Constantinople after Basil's death viewed the military aristocracy with deep suspicion. Provincial generals commanding theme armies had a disturbing tendency to rebel and march on Constantinople. The solution, from the civilian perspective, was to disband the theme armies and replace them with mercenaries who served for pay and had no independent power base. Constantine Nav Monomachus, that patron of philosophy and learning, cashiered 50,000 soldiers in a single decision, confident that the empire's diplomatic skills and wealth could purchase military security when needed. This decision proved catastrophic for multiple reasons. First, it eliminated the empire's most cost-effective military force. Theme soldiers cost almost nothing in peacetime, merely the administrative expense of maintaining their land grants. Mercenaries required constant payment in gold, draining the imperial treasury. Second, it destroyed military professionalism and continuity. Theme soldiers passed their skills from father to son. They knew the terrain they defended intimately. They had centuries of institutional knowledge about fighting the empire's traditional enemies. Mercenaries served for a season or a campaign, then disappeared, taking their experience with them. Third, and most dangerously, it eliminated the social connection between the military and the territory being defended. Theme soldiers fought for their homes, their families, their land. Mercenaries fought for gold, and if the gold stopped flowing or if defeat seemed likely, they had every incentive to desert. The army Romanos led to Manzikert embodied all these weaknesses. His core Byzantine troops, perhaps 10,000 professional soldiers from the Tagmata, were excellent fighters individually, but they were vastly outnumbered by mercenaries, auxiliaries and allies whose loyalty was questionable at best. The Frankish and Norman mercenaries had already demonstrated their unreliability by looting Byzantine civilians, forcing Romanos to dismiss them before the battle. The august Turkish auxiliaries, fighting against their ethnic cousins, could hardly be expected to show much enthusiasm. The Armenian and Georgian contingents came from buffer states that were as much victims of Byzantine pressure as they were allies. When the battle turned against Romanos, all these forces melted away, leaving the emperor with only his loyal core, and that proved insufficient. The Byzantine tactical doctrine also failed at Manzikert. For centuries, Byzantine armies had fought according to detailed military manuals, the most famous being the Strategikon attributed to Emperor Maurice from the 6th century, and the Tactica written by Emperor Leo VI in the early 10th century. These manuals prescribed formations, tactics, and strategies for defeating every enemy the empire might face. They were sophisticated documents that demonstrated Byzantine military professionalism and intellectual approach to warfare. But they were also products of their time, designed for enemies who fought in ways Byzantines understood. Heavy cavalry, disciplined infantry, siege warfare, naval combat. The Turks fought in none of these ways. The steppe nomads, of which the Seljuk Turks were the latest and most dangerous iteration, represented a military system that had confounded settled civilizations for millennia. The Huns had terrified Rome. The Mongols would later destroy every army they faced from China to Poland. The military effectiveness of horse archers stemmed from their mobility, their skill with the composite bow, and their tactical flexibility. A Turkish warrior learned to ride almost before he could walk. By age 10, he could shoot a bow from horseback at full gallop. By 15, he was a veteran of raids and skirmishes. By 20, he had seen more combat than most Byzantine soldiers would experience in a lifetime. The composite bow these warriors carried was itself a technological marvel. Made from layers of wood, horn and sinew, bound together with glue and wrapped in leather or bark, it required months to construct and years to master. But in skilled hands, it could propel an arrow with enough force to penetrate armour at 100 yards. The Turks used a thumb draw rather than the Mediterranean finger draw, allowing for faster shooting and more power. A skilled Turkish archer could loose 10 arrows per minute with accuracy, creating a rate of fire that no infantry crossbowman or longbowman could match. More importantly, the Turks' entire tactical system was built around mobility and harassment. They did not seek the decisive shock combat that European heavy cavalry preferred. Instead, they employed what military historians call the Parthian tactics, named after the Parthian Empire that had destroyed Roman legions using similar methods 1,000 years earlier. Turkish cavalry would approach an enemy formation, Loose volleys of arrows then retreat before the enemy could close. If heavy cavalry charged them, they simply rode away. Their smaller, lighter horses were slower than the heavy European destriers in a short sprint, but they had far greater endurance. The Turks could maintain this harassment for hours, wearing down an enemy through cumulative casualties and exhaustion. The feigned retreat was the most devastating component of Turkish tactics. When a Byzantine cavalry unit charged, the Turks would appear to break and flee. The Byzantines, thinking they had achieved victory, would pursue, their formation loosening as faster horses outpaced slower ones. When the pursuers were sufficiently disorganized and blown from the chase, the Turks would suddenly wheel around and counterattack. Caught in disorder, exhausted, and often separated from support, the Byzantine cavalry would be destroyed in detail. This tactic had been employed by steppe peoples for centuries, yet heavy cavalry forces repeatedly fell for it, driven by the warrior's instinct to pursue a fleeing enemy. At Manzikert, Romanos and his commanders were fully aware of these tactics in theory. Byzantine military manuals discussed how to fight horse archers. The recommended approach was to maintain tight formations, avoid pursuit, use infantry as a solid base that could not be easily harassed, and employ large numbers of archers to create counter-battery fire against the enemy horse archers. If these principles had been followed, the battle might have ended differently. But theory is one thing, and practice another, especially when your army includes mercenaries and auxiliaries who do not read military manuals and who act on instinct when under attack. The terrain around Manzikert also favoured the Turks. The Anatolian highlands were rolling grasslands, perfect cavalry country with few obstacles to mobility. There were no forests where Byzantine infantry could have taken shelter, no rivers to anchor a defensive position, no fortifications to fall back upon except distant Manzikert itself. The Byzantines were fighting on ground that maximised Turkish advantages and minimised their own. A more cautious commander might have recognised this and refused battle, falling back to more favourable terrain. But Romanos was under tremendous political pressure to achieve a decisive victory. He had promised to restore Byzantine control over Armenia and punish the Turkish raiders. Retreat would have been seen as failure, possibly costing him the throne even before Andronikos Doukas' betrayal sealed that fate. The breakdown of Byzantine discipline during the withdrawal proved decisive. Military historians have analysed this moment exhaustively, because it represents the critical point where a difficult situation became a catastrophe. The Byzantine army was not winning the battle in any meaningful sense. They had advanced across the field but had inflicted minimal casualties on the Turks while suffering steady losses to arrow fire. However, they were not yet defeated. Their formations remained largely intact. The emperor was still in command. If they could withdraw in good order to their fortified camp, they could rest, reorganize, and either renew the battle the next day or begin a strategic retreat to more favourable positions. But coordinated withdrawal is one of the most difficult military manoeuvres. It requires that orders be clearly communicated to all units simultaneously, that officers at every level understand and execute those orders precisely, and that soldiers trust their commanders enough to follow orders even when those orders seem to mean turning their backs on the enemy. At Manzikert, none of these conditions were met. The Byzantine army was strung out across a wide front. Communications were difficult. Units had become intermixed during the day's fighting, and crucially, the relationship between Romanos and several of his senior commanders, particularly Andronikos Doukas, was poisoned by political rivalry. When Romanos ordered the withdrawal, different parts of the army interpreted and executed the order differently. Some units maintained good order and began a disciplined retrograde movement. Others, exhausted and demoralized, simply broke and ran. The right wing, which had suffered particularly heavy casualties from Turkish archery, interpreted the withdrawal order as permission to flee. Soldiers threw down their weapons and shields to run faster. Officers lost control of their men. What should have been a coordinated movement became a rout on one flank. Andronikos Doukas' actions during this critical moment remain controversial even among historians. The sources are contradictory and biased. Byzantine historians loyal to the Doukas family claim Andronikos acted reasonably, interpreting the emperor's orders as a general retreat and marching his troops back to camp as instructed. Historians sympathetic to Romanos accuse Andronikos of deliberate treachery, abandoning the emperor out of loyalty to his family's political interests, or even as part of a premeditated plan to engineer Romanos' defeat and capture. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. Andronikos may not have deliberately betrayed Romanos, but he certainly did not go out of his way to save him. When he saw the battle turning into a disaster, he saved his own troops rather than risk them in a probably futile attempt to rescue the emperor. From Alp Arslan's perspective, the battle unfolded almost perfectly. His strategic decision to abandon his campaign against Aleppo and force march north had caught the Byzantines completely by surprise. His tactical approach, using the classic step tactics of harassment and feigned retreat, exploited every weakness in the Byzantine army. When he saw the Byzantine formation beginning to disintegrate during their withdrawal, he recognized the decisive moment and ordered the general assault. This was the moment when disciplined harassment became an all-out attack, when the crescent formation closed its horns, when the Turkish cavalry stopped retreating and charged home. The slaughter that followed was less extensive than legend would later claim, but it was brutal enough. Byzantine soldiers in full armour trying to run were easy targets for mounted archers. Men who fell were trampled or killed where they lay. Units that tried to stand and fight were surrounded and overwhelmed. The Byzantine centre, where Romanos fought with his guards, held out the longest, but eventually even imperial guards were mortal men, and they died like any others under massed archery and cavalry charges. The capture of Romanos was not the result of his cowardice. By all accounts, the emperor fought bravely, personally wielding his sword until he was physically unable to continue. He was in his late 40s or early 50s, not young for medieval warfare, and he had been fighting for hours in heavy armour in the August heat. When his horse was killed under him and he was surrounded by Turkish warriors, he had no choice but to surrender. That he survived at all was somewhat fortunate. In the chaos of battle, a captured enemy, even an emperor, might easily be killed by soldiers who did not recognise his importance. The aftermath of the battle saw thousands of Byzantine soldiers scattered across the Anatolian highlands. Many eventually made their way back to Byzantine territory. Others were captured and enslaved or ransomed. Some, particularly the mercenaries and auxiliaries, simply deserted and went home. The material losses were significant. The Byzantine army's baggage train, containing supplies, treasure, and the emperor's personal effects, fell into Turkish hands. Weapons, armour, horses, all the expensive equipment of war was lost. But again, these were survivable losses. The empire was wealthy enough to replace equipment. What could not be easily replaced was prestige, confidence, and political stability. Alp Arslan's treatment of his imperial prisoner revealed the Sultan's sophistication as a statesman. He could have executed Romanos, paraded him through the Islamic world in chains, or demanded a crushing ransom that would have bankrupted the Byzantine Empire. Instead, he chose a middle path that demonstrated both mercy and strategic calculation. By treating Romanos with respect, dining with him, and negotiating a reasonable peace treaty, Alp Arslan sent several messages. To the Islamic world, he demonstrated that the Seljuks were not barbarians, but civilized rulers who understood statecraft and showed magnanimity in victory. To the Byzantine court, he suggested that peace with the Seljuks was possible and even desirable, and to potential rivals and rebels within his own empire, he showed that the Sultan was strong enough to be merciful, secure enough in his power that he did not need to prove his strength through cruelty. The peace treaty negotiated between Alp Arslan and Romanos was remarkably moderate, given the magnitude of Byzantine defeat. Romanos agreed to cede several fortresses in Armenia, to pay an annual tribute, reportedly 1.5 million gold pieces, though the exact amount is disputed, to release all Turkish prisoners held by Byzantium, and to provide military assistance if the Sultan requested it. In exchange, Alp Arslan would cease raids into Byzantine territory and return Romanos to Constantinople. If these terms had been implemented, the Byzantine Empire would have become essentially a client state of the Seljuk Empire, a humiliating arrangement but not necessarily a fatal one. Client states can recover their independence when circumstances change. But the treaty was never implemented because the political situation in Constantinople made it impossible. The Dukas family's coup while Romanos was a prisoner represented Byzantine political dysfunction at its worst. The empire faced an existential crisis. Turkish armies controlled much of Armenia and were raiding deep into Anatolia. The emperor was a captive. The logical response would have been national unity, rallying behind whatever leadership could restore military effectiveness and territorial integrity. Instead, the Dukas family saw opportunity. With Romanos captured and apparently finished, they could restore their own control of the imperial throne. Using the Varangian Guard, the elite Scandinavian warriors who served as imperial bodyguards and who were loyal to whoever paid them. Caesar John Ducas engineered a coup that made his nephew Michael VII sole emperor and reduced Empress Eudokia to monastic retirement. When Romanos returned to Constantinople and discovered he had been deposed, he faced an impossible situation. He could accept his deposition and retirement, trusting that the Ducas family would allow him to live peacefully in exile. Or he could fight, raising an army from his supporters and marching on the capital. Romanos chose to fight, partly from personal pride, but partly from a genuine belief that the empire needed strong military leadership. The civil war that followed was relatively brief but extremely damaging. Byzantine armies that should have been defending the frontier against Turkish incursions were instead fighting each other. Resources that should have been devoted to reconstruction were consumed by internal conflict, and the empire's reputation, already damaged by defeat at Manzikert, was further degraded by the spectacle of Romans fighting Romans while their enemies watched and profited. The blinding of Romanos after his final defeat was both a personal tragedy and a symbolic moment. Blinding was a traditional Byzantine punishment for failed emperors and rebels, because it rendered a man ineligible for the throne without killing him. In theory, it was a merciful alternative to execution. In practice, it was often botched, and the victim died from infection or shock. Romanos's blinding was particularly brutal, either through incompetence or deliberate cruelty, and he died shortly afterward. The man who had tried to save the empire through military vigour, who had fought bravely at Manzikert, who had endured captivity with dignity, died in agony, murdered by his own countrymen. It was a fitting symbol for the empire itself, destroying itself from within while external enemies gathered. The decade following, Manzikert saw the Byzantine Empire enter what historians call the Time of Troubles. 8 separate rebellions erupted between 1071 and 1081. Rival claimants to the throne raised armies and fought for control. The Ducas family held Constantinople but could not control the provinces. Generals who should have been fighting Turks instead fought each other, and critically, all sides in these civil wars hired mercenaries, including Turkish mercenaries, to fight for them. This had catastrophic consequences for Anatolia. The Turkish migration into Anatolia after Manzikert was not organised conquest. Alp Arslan did not order his armies to occupy Byzantine territory. In fact, he largely lost interest in the Byzantine frontier after Manzikert, turning his attention back to his original objective, the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. When he died in 1072, killed under somewhat mysterious circumstances during a campaign in Transoxiana, his son Malik Shah succeeded him, and likewise focused primarily on consolidating Seljuk control over the Islamic heartlands. The Sultanate of Rum, the Turkish state that would eventually control most of Anatolia, was not founded by Alp Arslan or Malik Shah, but by Suleiman ibn Kutalmish, a cousin who had initially been a rebel against Seljuk authority. What happened instead was a gradual, almost organic migration of Turkish tribes into Anatolia. These tribes, consisting of pastoral nomads with their families, flocks and herds, had been moving slowly westward for generations, pushed by population pressure in Central Asia and drawn by the wealth of settled civilizations. After Manzikert, they discovered that Anatolia was open. Byzantine military power had collapsed. The theme armies that had defended the frontier were disbanded. The fortresses that had anchored Byzantine defence were undermanned or abandoned. Local populations, exhausted by heavy taxation and alienated by religious controversies, often offered a minimal resistance. In some cases, they welcomed the Turks as liberators from Byzantine oppression. The Turkish tribes simply moved in, not as conquerors, but as settlers. They occupied pasture land for their flocks. They established villages. They built mosques. When Byzantine forces attempted to drive them out, they fought, and their superior mobility and archery usually gave them victory. When no Byzantine forces appeared, which was increasingly common, they simply stayed. Over time, what had been temporary encampments became permanent settlements. The Turkish language began to replace Greek in daily use. Islam began to replace Christianity as the dominant religion. The physical landscape changed as churches were converted to mosques or fell into ruin, as Greek towns were renamed with Turkish names, as the agricultural patterns shifted to accommodate pastoral nomadism. The Byzantine response to this migration was hampered by the empire's political chaos. Michael VII, who ruled from 1071 to 1078, was a scholarly man, a student of Michael Psellus. Interested in philosophy and literature, he was utterly unsuited to be a warrior emperor in a time of crisis. His attempts at military reform were half-hearted and ineffective. His financial policies, particularly the decision to devalue the gold numisma, the empire's currency that had been stable for 700 years, wrecked Byzantine economic credibility. Inflation soared, tax revenues declined. The ability to hire and maintain mercenary armies was compromised. Meanwhile, Turkish tribes continued their migration, and Byzantine Anatolia continued to shrink. Nikephoros III, Botanayats, who seized the throne in 1078, was a better general, but too old and infirm to mount effective campaigns. His 3-year reign saw further losses in Anatolia and the Balkans, where the Normans and Pechenegs took advantage of Byzantine weakness. By 1081, when Alexios Komnenos finally brought stability through his own coup, the situation was desperate. Of the 29 themes that had existed in Anatolia in 1025, fewer than half remained under effective Byzantine control. The heartland was gone. Alexios I, who had ruled from 1081 to 1118, was one of the great Byzantine emperors, a military genius and political survivor who stabilized the empire through sheer force of will and tactical brilliance. But even Alexios could not undo the damage of the previous decade. He managed to halt further Turkish expansion. He recovered some territory through military campaigns and diplomatic agreements. He defeated Norman and Pecheneg threats to Constantinople itself, but he could not recover Anatolia. The Turkish presence was too entrenched, too numerous, too well established. The best he could hope for was to stabilize what remained and prevent further catastrophic losses. It was Alexios's appeal to Pope Urban II in 1095 that set in motion the First Crusade. The emperor had requested military assistance, probably hoping for a manageable force of a few thousand veteran soldiers that he could employ as mercenaries. What he got was an enormous, uncontrolled mob of crusaders, tens of thousands of warriors from all over Western Europe, motivated by religious fervour, desire for land and glory, and following their own agendas. The Crusaders helped Alexios recover some territory in western Anatolia, but they also created new problems. They captured Antioch and Jerusalem, establishing Crusader states that were nominally Christian allies, but were in practice independent and often hostile to Byzantine interests. The cultural and religious divide between Latin Catholics and Greek Orthodox, already wide, became a chasm that would eventually lead to the horrific sack of Constantinople in 1204. For the Turkish tribes in Anatolia, the Crusades were a challenge but not an existential threat. The Sultanate of Rum, established with its capital first at Nicaea and later at Konya, became a significant power. Under capable sultans like Kilij Arslan Thas and his successors, the Rum Sultanate maintained itself against Crusader attacks, Byzantine pressure, and rival Turkish emirates. The First Crusade temporarily disrupted Turkish control of western Anatolia, but the Turks adapted, learned to fight the heavily armoured Crusader knights, and eventually recovered their position. By the mid-12th century, the Sultanate of Rum was a stable, prosperous state that would last until the Mongol invasions of the 13th century. The transformation of Anatolia was gradual but thorough. In 1071, Anatolia was overwhelmingly Greek-speaking and Christian. By 1200, large areas were Turkish-speaking and Muslim. By 1300, Turkish was the dominant language across most of the plateau. The process was not entirely peaceful. There were massacres, forced conversions, and deportations, but there were also more peaceful transitions. Many local populations converted to Islam to avoid the jizya, the tax on non-Muslims, or to gain access to positions in the Turkish administration. Intermarriage occurred. Cultural exchange happened. Greek and Armenian Christians continued to live in Anatolia for centuries under Turkish rule, sometimes prospering, sometimes suffering persecution, but always as minorities in what had once been their heartland. The Byzantine Empire survived Manzikert by nearly 4 centuries, finally falling to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 when Sultan Mehmed II conquered Constantinople. But the empire that fell in 1453 was a shadow of what had existed before 1071. At its peak under Basil the Rune, the Byzantine Empire stretched from southern Italy to Armenia, from the Danube to Syria. At its end, it controlled only Constantinople itself and a few scattered territories in Greece. The loss of Anatolia was the crucial blow. Anatolia had provided soldiers, food, and tax revenue. Without it, the empire could not sustain itself as a great power. Manzikert did not destroy the Byzantine Empire immediately, but it began the process of destruction that would take centuries to complete, but was ultimately irreversible. The historical assessment of Manzikert has evolved over time. Medieval Byzantine historians writing in the immediate aftermath portrayed it as an apocalyptic disaster, the moment when God's favour abandoned the empire. They exaggerated the casualties, claiming tens of thousands killed when the reality was probably a quarter of that. They portrayed Romanos as either a heroic martyr, betrayed by treasonous subordinates, or as an incompetent fool whose arrogance led to disaster, depending on their political loyalties. They portrayed the Turks as savage barbarians or as instruments of divine punishment. None of these portrayals were entirely accurate, but they shaped the Byzantine understanding of what had happened. Modern historians, with access to Turkish and Arabic sources as well as Greek ones, and with the benefit of hindsight, present a more nuanced picture. They recognise that Manzikert was a significant Byzantine defeat, but not an annihilating one. The crucial factor was not the battle itself, but the political collapse that followed. They recognise that Turkish expansion into Anatolia was not organised conquest, but opportunistic migration. They understand that Alp Arslan was not a barbarian warlord, but a sophisticated ruler balancing multiple strategic objectives. They see the battle as a symptom of Byzantine weakness rather than the cause of that weakness. Yet for all this nuance, Manzikert remains a pivotal moment. It was the day when the Byzantine Empire's pretensions to universal authority were shattered. It was the moment when the Turkish presence in Anatolia, previously limited to raids and temporary occupations, became permanent. It was the beginning of a process that would culminate in the Ottoman Empire, a Turkish Muslim state that would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean and Balkans for 6 centuries. The Byzantine Empire claimed to be the continuation of Rome, the eternal empire ordained by God to bring Christianity and civilization to the world. After Manzikert, that claim rang increasingly hollow. The empire survived, but it was mortal, vulnerable, declining. The purple had been stained with defeat, and that stain would never fully wash clean. On August 26, 1071, 2 armies met on the Anatolian plain. One represented an empire over 1,000 years old, claiming descent from Caesar Augustus, protected by God, the greatest Christian power on earth. The other represented a people who had erupted from the Central Asian steppes just decades earlier. Nomads who fought from horseback with composite bows, recent converts to Islam seeking wealth, glory and land. When the dust settled and the sun set on that day, the nomads had won and the empire had lost. That single day did not destroy Byzantium, but it began the destruction. The doors of Anatolia swung open and the Turks walked through. They never left. The Battle of Manzikert was not the end of the Byzantine Empire, but it was the beginning of the end, and that made all the difference.